Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Well, happy days are here again. And, well, you know, understanding a question is half an answer. And this is, of course, Half the Answer with your host, Trent R. Nelson. And, of course, Dr. Caitlin M. Green. She's co-host. She's chilling, as always. Got the choker looking like it's 1999. It's a good day. And we are here to talk about some really timeless topics today. Caitlin, who have you brought for us to learn from today?
Oh, Trent, I'm so excited. I have with me Rebecca Sear, who is the director of the Center for Culture and Evolution at Brunel University, London. And she's also the president of the European Human Behavior and Evolution Association. I brought the big guns today. Sorry to inform you, but we have a real smarty pants on our hands.
When don't you bring the heat? That's the question that I have.
Thank you for that very flattering question, because I do try. I feel like, you know, being on academic social media, I have access to some of the great minds that are fighting misinformation and are investigating the ways in which academia sometimes gets taken over by bad ideas, harmful ideas. We here at Half the Answer could not help but notice that the Silicon Valley guys and the US government guys have a lot of feelings about birth rates and babies, telling us we have got to have babies to save the world. But also, for some reason, they're rejecting the idea of things like immigration from other countries, and they're like making things harder for poor people to keep their families alive, and you know, the kinds of things that you would think would help us with our birth rate problems, such as they are. So let's go to a clip. Let's see if I can do it. Ready?
What ended most civilizations was a low birth rate. An extended period of prosperity seems to cause birth rates to plummet. It's somewhat counterintuitive. When a society is under stress, birth rates increase. So if you look at, say, ancient Rome, the birth rates were super high when they were fighting the Carthaginians, and Rome's very life was at stake. Birth rates were all-time high. After they defeated Carthage and ruled the Mediterranean, the birth rates plummeted, and to such a degree that Julius Caesar even tried to pass, laws like in 50 BC or something like that, to give an incentive for any Roman citizen that would have a second or third child. So they were having birth rate issues in 50 BC, which is pretty wild. And that was also true of really basically every civilization throughout history. So it's how do you avoid this birth rate collapse? What ended?
Okay.
I'm glad we don't have to listen anymore of him right now.
Yeah, it was a short. It's from an account called Musk Motivation. Do you feel motivated?
I feel motivated to never watch anything he says ever again. Yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about, like, you know, people who have no expertise in an area just going wild, right? So he's here talking about every civilization in history has collapsed because their birth rate went down because they were having too good a time, which is really reminiscent of some other discourses that we've seen, which is it's essentially like soft men create hard times create hard men create good times, right?
Right.
Which is like an old right-wing saying that it says essentially like when we're too soft on each other, we devolve into degeneracy and we stop making good, strong children. And then there's some kind of like civilizational collapse that's impending, right? Our vice president has called the US birth rate situation a civilizational crisis too. He was at the March for Life telling people to stop being so selfish and just have more babies for our country. I think I won't subject you to that clip, but he was at the March for Life being like, there's this radical individualist belief system, this ideology that's causing people to not have enough children. And thank goodness for the repeal of Roe v. Wade, right? Because now we're going to have, this influx of new babies that's going to save us, right? And, you know, that was in the language of the Supreme Court decision as well, that this is to protect kind of the stock of babies of these are people, right? Babies, but the stock, like they're livestock. So at a time when the Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels, and the Sam Altmans of this world are pumping money into embryo selection services, when tradwife is a type of influencer that is unavoidable for the terminally online like me, when there seems to be a political movement that says they desperately want to increase the number of young people in this country, but at the same time don't seem okay with immigration, are proposing policies that take away medical and food benefits from millions of families, are making it harder to get vaccines on the basis that healthy kids will be fine without them, it makes the conclusion inescapable that there is a certain kind of population increase that these people are looking to promote. And it can really only be motivated by a pseudoscientific belief that there are some kinds of people who are innately, genetically more robust and more successful. And this belief did not come out of nowhere. So that's why we wanted to bring on an expert in how scientific racism and eugenics manipulate science and promote disturbing political ideologies, and how it came to prominence, or at least acceptance, in academia to have these kind of beliefs that are not necessarily very empirically grounded, and also are not very ethically acceptable. Does that make sense? So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to hear what you have to say about eugenics, race science, the acceptance thereof. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Very warm here in London.
Oh, yeah. Okay, here too in Oregon, we're having a real heat wave. I fear my vegetable garden is not going to make it. We'll see. I'm trying. She's limping along.
I mean, a lot of these ideas that were just denoted in the screed, I mean, I hear echoes of folks from Theodore Roosevelt to like Plato, like we mustn't like tend to the ill because a strong man either gets like a superficial help, or he just continues going about his work until he passes away, right? But there's a sort of nihilism in this belief of like a superior folks, such that everyone else, just like it always is, can just go bite it. It doesn't really matter. It really devalues human life at a basic level, he thinks.
Yeah, it takes survival of the fittest to like its deepest, darkest place, I think, where it's easy to forget that we're dealing with real people, and that real people do actually have like, rights that we should be respecting. So Rebecca, what is eugenics and where did it come from?
So as Trent just said, the ideas behind eugenics have been around for a very, very long time. The idea that some groups of people are just superior to others and others inferior. But eugenics really got a good start in academia, at least, around the turn of the 20th century. So Francis Galton, one of Darwin's cousins, coined the term eugenics in 1883. There are various definitions of it, but one I'll use here is it's an ideology that human populations can be improved through social policies, like selective breeding, encouraging people with so-called desirable traits to reproduce, to have children, and discouraging people with undesirable traits. Other policies like migration also come into play. Eugenics is about encouraging desirable people to come into your country and discouraging undesirable people. So it's an ideology because it means some people in positions of power have to make value judgments about who is deserving of reproduction or migration and who's undeserving. But around the turn of the 20th century, it was really pretty popular, quite mainstream. Politicians inside academia as well. A lot of people really went for eugenics in a big way. And it was quite influential in the origins of some academic disciplines. People got interested in disciplines like psychology or demography or statistics because they wanted to research eugenic themes. Right. But it wasn't completely uncontested, even in the early 20th century. It was mainstream, but it wasn't universally accepted. So Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection alongside Darwin, he said that eugenics is simply the meddlesome interference of an arrogant scientific priestcraft. So he was not a fan at all. He said,
Love
if you want to improve the quality of human populations, then improve people's environments, give them good conditions, and they'll be fine. You don't need to fiddle around with their genes.
Right.
Because it's based on this ideology that some groups of people are superior and some inferior, it's also going to involve violating people's human rights. So this is really fundamental to eugenic ideology. Eugenics assumes natural hierarchies, and the kinds of things that have been influential in eugenic ideology have been race. We've talked about scientific racism, but the idea that white people are inherently genetically superior to black people, but also things like class. In the UK in the early 20th century, eugenics was all about class, concerns about poor people spreading their inferior genes through the population, because it was believed that poor people were poor because of some defect in themselves. They were essentially too stupid or too lazy to become rich. Obviously, Nazi Germany, as is very well known, took these ideas to their logical conclusion, if you like, by not simply preventing undesirable people from reproducing, but depriving them of life, of exterminating them in very large numbers in gas chambers. And again, as is well known, the kinds of people they thought were undesirable were based around religion. They murdered as many as 6 million Jews, but also ethnicity. They targeted Roma populations, and also other groups of people like disabled people and gay men as well.
Absolutely. And again, like, I'm always struck when I hear the term eugenics, what it actually would have meant at a base level, right? Like goodly stock, right? And yet I always also am reminded of Thomas More and him punning utopia, E-U-T-O-P-I-A, as utopia, no place, from a good place to a no place, because the perfect place couldn't exist. And I feel a similar feeling, of course, towards eugenics. It should be spelled with just a U, because it is a fairy tale. It's a fairy story we tell ourselves from watching cows breed and watching dogs, and we come up with these conclusions that it could work the same. And yet, how often have we been proven false that we can't take the hint, Rebecca? Why does it persist in the human mind?
That's a really good question, and it's maybe one that's too big for me to answer right now. I will answer it, though, in the context of academia, how these ideas maintain a foothold in academia. So it was pretty mainstream in academia in the early 20th century, but it did decline in popularity during the 20th century. That was partly because of the Nazis.
It had a little PR problem.
It certainly did. But that wasn't the only reason. So during the 20th century, as research on eugenic themes moved forward, it became obvious that eugenics isn't a science, it is an ideology. It just won't work. So that is one important reason why eugenic ideology did fade away from academia during the 20th century. Not immediately after the Second World War, I have to say, even despite that PR problem, it took a little time to fade. But by the 1960s, journals which had previously had the word eugenics in their titles were renaming themselves, trying to distance themselves from eugenics. But there were people who really wanted to keep those ideas alive, particularly, although not only in the context of race. So in the 1960s, a pseudo-journal called Mankind Quarterly was set up by a group of people who really wanted to continue producing what looked like research that proved essentially that Black people are inferior to white people. It was set up by people like Corrado Gini of the Gini coefficient. He was a big Mussolini fan. Reginald Ruggles Gates was another founder. He was briefly married to Mary Stopes, the family planning campaigner, who was also a eugenicist. Ruggles Gates was so extreme, he believed that different races, different human races, are different subspecies. So very, very different. So there were people in academia who tried very, very hard to keep these ideologies alive throughout the 20th century, despite the fact that by the 1960s it was becoming very obvious that eugenics doesn't work, but also the idea that Black and white people are genetically different is really not scientifically tenable. But geneticists and biologists now tell us very clearly that race has no biological reality. There is obviously genetic and biological variation between people, but it doesn't sort neatly into racial categories. Somebody from Africa, for example, would be racialized as Black in the US or the UK, but Africa is a hugely genetically diverse continent. Black people do not have, a similar genotype that makes them fundamentally different from white people. That's simply not how genetics works. So scientific racism, it's the belief that there are, or the use and misuse of science to claim that there are genetically determined differences between Black and white people and other races. It's not science, it is racism, because we know race has no biological meaning.
It's so funny that, that is a really basic fundamental presupposition of the whole endeavor, right? That you can group people according to genotype. And they try to sort of gussy it up by being like, well, it's polygenic. So there's like lots of different traits and it's on like a sliding scale. And so we're actually making like a probabilistic claim. But again, it rests on this idea that you can create these like lines in between categories in order to compare groups, and it is simply not a thing that is real. It is fantasy, right? And so we have to sit here and listen to multisyllabic words like polygenic and be like, oh, perhaps he has something really serious to say, and we all like strokey beard time, and like it just isn't a real thing. Thank you for stroking a real beard for me, Trent, so that I could illustrate what that looks like.
Why I'm here.
Yeah. I've got my skull in the background, so we're like really ready for race science today. I still need a pair of calipers. I don't have one. But, it's something I really wanted to underscore is that we're being expected to accept a set of arguments that are standing on essentially vapor. There's nothing under it, right? The idea that there are these categories, it's make-em-ups. And I'm sick of pretending that it's not.
And it's misguided scientifically from multiple perspectives. We know that there's no biological reality to race, but also a lot of what the race scientists say about how different races have evolved different characteristics doesn't make sense from the point of view of evolutionary social science. So in the evolutionary social sciences, the standard viewpoint is that essentially the cognitive architecture of everyone on the planet is more or less the same. There is obviously huge behavioral variability across different populations, across different people, but that's not on the whole genetically determined. We are, one of our defining traits as a species is our behavioral flexibility. That's allowed us to spread across the globe. We have all kinds of different subsistence strategies, marriage, relationship patterns. We are very, very behaviorally diverse, but that isn't underpinned by genetic differences. That behavioral flexibility is either stems from the environment. So there's a concept called phenotypic plasticity in biology, where you have the same genotype that gives rise to different phenotypes in different environments. Non-behavioral example is always an easy one to give, but like puberty. The age of puberty varies in different environments. If you have access to good nutrition, good medical care, you have an earlier age of puberty than if you don't. That's an example of phenotypic plasticity. That's not to do with genetic differences. It's because because growth is easier, basically, if you have a lot of good nutrition and health care. So behavioral flexibility in our species is either this phenotypic plasticity or it's to do with culture and cultural evolution. We are a species that uses culture a lot. This allows us to learn different things from the people around us without having genetically determined patterns of behavior. So from the point of view of evolutionary social science as well, there is no validity to what race scientists say about how different races have evolved different behavioral or cognitive characteristics. It's bad social science as well as being bad science.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of them blame what they call like the sociological fallacy. And of course, they like to straw man it as saying that this is like a blank slate position, which is to say that like genetics have no impact on a person, which is simply not the position of the people that they're supposed to be arguing against, right? Like we all understand that there's DNA and that it is making changes, that it is determining like a lot of things about how our body is formed. But what we are also saying is that a person develops in an environment as well, and perhaps more importantly, depending on who you ask, right? Yeah, I mean, as a parent of young children, it's something that I'm always thinking about too, is, where's the nature and where's the nurture, right? Like my children have blue eyes and green eyes because my husband and I have blue eyes and green eyes. But also, there's a lot of things about their upbringing that is different from ours. We all grew up in different states. We all grew up around different people. We had different nutritional inputs, right? Food is different from how it was when we were born, and advice about how to feed your baby and how to feed your children has changed since we were children. Everything is different, right? Like even within the same country, we were all born and raised in America. However, a lot of stuff has changed, right?
Yeah, which I think may be one reason why 21st century scientific racism and eugenic ideology tends not to be found in anthropology, because anthropologists are well aware of all of the things that you just said. It tends to be found in psychology, a discipline that focuses very much on Western populations. It's well known that all of psychology comes from the studies are based on a very narrow range of people, and I think that is one of the reasons why it leads to some problematic thinking in psychology.
I mean, a lot of it is you send an email out to all the undergrads at your institution and you like have them sit, right? I was one of those undergrads because I was a psych major briefly in college before I changed over to linguistics, where I went and I participated in some studies. It was all people like me that they were researching.
And for some research questions, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to understand the evolution of the human mind, it's maybe not so fine.
Right.
I want to get into, and this may be a little outside of your scope, but don't worry, I've got us covered. I want to get into the claims of like what eugenics is and isn't, because what I find a lot of times is that proponents of eugenics will say, this is not eugenics, this is something else. But as you touched on in your earlier definition of eugenics, there are a lot of ways to achieve what is essentially an outcome goal, right? This ideology has a goal, which is a few generations from now, we will have a better population than we have today, right? By doing something. And in some cases, that's a government policy intervention, like forced sterilization or putting people in camps who are undesirable or killing people who are undesirable, right? But there's also things that people consider to be less coercive, like positive eugenics, which is sort of incentivizing the births of better kinds of people, right? So that includes these kind of baby bonuses that Trump is talking about in the US. That includes things that J.D. Vance talks about as well. I mean, there are tax breaks for families.
Good gives the game away in itself.
I know.
Good baby, right? What is a good baby?
What is a good baby?
Right. That in itself needs to be focused on this idea that that good is some fundamental thing that exists in the world, as opposed to our own perceptions and biases. I think this leads automatically to, well, yes, the perfect baby is the one that has all of the traits that I idealize in myself, right? And so,
well, like a lot of eugenicists, a lot of eugenics proponents today will say, I am not saying that there is a type of baby that is better than any other. I'm just saying we should select for better traits. And you're like, I can't help you understand how you just said two opposite things, right? So like, I want to show a clip. I want to show a clip from an NBC feature, and I do apologize to you, to the audience, and to everyone that we are about to watch part of a feature about the Collins family, which is the pronatalist couple that is like desperate to be famous for being the pronatalist couple. You will recognize them by their very annoying glasses. And they keep naming their children things like Titus Invictus and like Americus Industry, something. It's like, it's absurd, it's painful, it hurts my heart. But I want to watch them deny that they are into eugenics, because apparently they're not into eugenics, and how dare you suggest. Okay, so this one's called Meet a Pronatalist Couple. All right, are we sharing? We're sharing.
Like Britt Benjamin, who argues it's not government policy that will solve this problem, but families prioritizing more children.
I'm not sure that there is a policy or some sort of nudge that the government can do, aside maybe from lowering taxes. I really do think it's more about our attitudes.
Critics of this movement say the pronatalists don't simply want to promote more babies, but certain types of babies. As part of their IVF, the Collins do genetic testing on their embryos, prioritizing traits that they say will give their kids the, quote, best roll of the dice.
We've been called the hipster eugenicists. It's hilarious. We're absolutely definitionally not eugenicists. Eugenics involves, one, establishing that there are universally good and bad traits, and two, trying to increase or decrease those traits on a population-wide level. We do not believe that there are universally good or bad traits. Why do the genetic testing in your embryos? We looked really carefully at cancer. We also looked at a lot of mental performance adjacent traits like anxiety, brain fog, and ability to deal with stress. And of course, we also looked at intelligence because that correlates with pretty much everything from pro-sociality to health.
But some bioethicists say
Okay, so just to recap, we are not eugenicists because eugenics involves selecting for specific traits. We are people who did polygenic embryo scoring on anxiety, brain fog, intelligence, and we selected the embryos that we wanted the most based on those scores, which is not the same thing, except that it is the same thing, right? Like they just like don't want to commit. And I think that's part of the like the PR problem of eugenics, right? But this is a commitment to the idea that you can scientifically determine a behavioral or intelligence-based outcome on the genes of an embryo that has not had a chance to form in an environment that's going to actually have more of an impact on those things, right? And it's, you know, the definitions of eugenics goes all the way back to, as you said, Francis Galton, who had no qualms about saying this is about improvement, this is about making things better on a genetic basis. So his definition, one of his definitions was, it's the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which takes cognizance of all influences that tend, in however remote a degree, to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So I think that if you let Francis Galton meet the Collinses, he would have said, wow, it's really nice to meet some very lovely eugenicists, right? He talked a lot about higher and lower levels of organism, right, of person. He said, whenever a low race is preserved under conditions of life that exact a high level of efficiency, it must be subjected to rigorous selection. The few best specimens of that race can alone be allowed to become parents, and not many of their descendants can be allowed to live. On the other hand, if a higher race be substituted for the low one, all this terrible misery disappears. The most merciful form of what I ventured to call eugenics would consist in watching for the indications of superior strains or races, and in so favoring them that their progeny shall outnumber and gradually replace that of the old one.
What's incredible about listening to that sort of thing is that it is also like reading the Republic, where like there are many lines where that same type of status is discussed, whether it be the myth of the metals or whether it be discussing their eugenic society, which like we talked about infanticide and preserving only the best in marriage and in husbandry.
Yeah. Well, it was
so far we travel in 20 centuries.
Yeah. Well, philosopher Peter Singer, I think in the last 10 or 15 years, suggested if your baby has like spina bifida or something, you should probably just kill it, like your live baby that you just had, because that will give you a chance to make another better baby, right? It is an attitude that persists even if it's not uncritically accepted, right? Like Rebecca was saying, there's always answers to this, right? There's always critics of this kind of ideology, but it keeps poking its head up. And I think something that was in your talk that I thought was really useful, this is in the sort of like, what do we do section? Oh my gosh, what do we do? And one of the things that you said is something that I have also been saying, which is why I liked it, which was that, you know, you don't need to accept this claim that like we're being censored as a reason to entertain their beliefs, right? So we have lots and lots of sort of quote unquote canceled academics who make a huge name off of that, right? I'm trying to find your slide on that because you had a lot of really good examples. But one of them to me is that's a really good example is Bo Weingard, who he was a psychology assistant professor, I think, and he was criticized for having beliefs that one could construe as being eugenic beliefs, and he has said that's not right. I don't do scientific racism. I don't do eugenics. But just a few days ago, I saw an article by him in Aporia magazine, that's from the Pioneer Fund, right? Which is it is a eugenics publication. It's a race science publication. And he wrote an article for them called Sasha Gusev is Wrong. After all these years, the black-white IQ gap sure looks genetic. So I'm not sure about this claim that he's not into scientific racism. And he goes pretty masked off in it, where he says, like, it's not right to blame the academic achievement gap between Black people and white people on their environment. He says, smart parents tend to attain a higher socioeconomic status and have smart children because they're genetically predisposed to do so. It's not because they're like raising their children any different or the environment that those children are in is any different, that their life is less stressful and they have more good food and more good medicine. Certainly it's nothing to do with any of that, right? Their parents have more time to give them all of that sort of like outside of school education that they need to do well. No, it's none of that, right? In fact, he says you can't blame discrimination at all anymore in the year 2025. He says, on the contrary, elites in the United States have worked assiduously to raise Black performance, not to suppress it. They have spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to close the race gap. They have discriminated against whites and Asians in college admissions on the job market. They have castigated whites for talking honestly about group differences. They have promulgated bizarre theories of systemic racism and elevated Black mediocrities to positions of undeserved prominence. And yet, the IQ gap remains impressively stable and apparently impervious to environmental intervention. And he goes on to blame like the progressives having these sacred values that you're not allowed to question or else you'll get kicked out of academia, right? It's more of this, you can't give evidence for the argument that you're trying to push forward. Instead, you have to say, nobody will let me talk about it. Nobody's talking about it. There's no way.
So to give an example from some of the work I've done on scientific racism, one of the main proponents of scientific racism was a psychologist called Richard Lynn. So Richard Lynn was an academic psychologist who worked very hard to promote the idea that Black people are genetically less intelligent than white people, for example, by producing what he called a database of national IQs. So he claimed he'd put together a database which gave an estimate of the average IQ in nation states worldwide. This was... He first made it available in 2002, though he'd been working on it before, and it's been widely used now in the academic literature. The problem is it has absolutely no scientific merit whatsoever. And this is blatantly obvious if you spend approximately 5 minutes looking at the construction of this data set.
Right.
For one thing, he has never stated his methodology for selecting samples to build a data set. So if you're going to do something like this, you're effectively doing what's called a systematic review. You're reviewing all of the literature that's published on cognitive scores, and you're sampling some of those studies to put into your database, ones that you think are suitable for constructing national IQs. And then you're doing all of these manipulations to the data to come up with a single number for nation states worldwide. Systematic reviews have to have a stated methodology. You have to know how people chose to select studies from the literature in order to build the database. If you don't have that stated methodology, you can't trust the output. There's no trust involved in the database. Although Richard Lynn has put that database together over many decades, he never wrote a methodology which explains why he selected samples. If you look at the samples that were included in the database, it is very hard to understand why some of them were included. For example, the national IQ of Angola is estimated from a sample of 1919 people. Angola has more than 30 million people. You cannot estimate a national IQ or national anything from a sample of 19 people. Nobody believes that. It's simply absurd. That's the smallest sample size included in the database, but there are many, many, many other examples. This is mainly a problem in Africa, although not entirely, because the data is less available for Africa. But for example, some populations, some nation states have IQs estimated from samples of refugee children who were living in a neighboring country. The IQ of Botswana is estimated from a handful of adolescents who were surveyed in South Africa. There's no evidence that these South African adolescents had ever set foot in Botswana, yet they represent the Botswana national IQ. The whole thing is just completely ludicrous, and that is very, very obvious if you spend the shortest amount of time looking into the construction of this database. Somehow it has become firmly embedded in the academic literature. There are now more than 160 papers which have used the database published in mainstream journals, published by the big academic publishers like Elsevier and Springer, very frequently in the journal called Intelligence. This is the flagship journal of the International Society of Intelligence Research. Weingard has used this database, and he continues to defend it to this day, even though in 2020 he had a paper retracted which used the database. It somehow accidentally got published in a relatively respectable journal, Psychological Science, and several people raised concerns about the database, and that paper was retracted because of concerns about the data. That's what the statement says. So if you're using a database which is so obviously absurd and was clearly designed to prove that black and white people have genetic differences in intelligence, because Richard Lynn promoted these ideas very widely outside of academia. There's a lot of evidence now from historians and sociologists of science that he talked a lot to policymakers, he spoke a lot to public audiences, he published a lot in white supremacist outlets like VDare. He worked very hard to get his ideas out of academia. So the National IQ database, it's a political project, very obviously. It's not science, and he used it to promote a political ideology. If you're still defending that database in the 2020s, you shouldn't be in academia because you're not a competent scientist.
Yeah, there's so many methodological problems, so many collection issues that it doesn't make any sense, right? The only reason why you would be defending it is if you're invested in that political project, right? Of legitimizing the belief that there are inferior places to be from and superior places, genetically speaking, right? And that database was used pretty extensively in the book, The Bell Curve, right? And so, yeah, I was reading Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which is like your jaw's on the floor, basically every other page, right? But what I was learning was that book almost didn't happen, if not for the interventions of right-wing political think tanks that have funds that are specifically for the purpose of helping to kind of put an academic veneer on these beliefs of white supremacy, right? That this guy, the author, what's his name? Charles Murray? Is that him? Yeah. I've already forgotten. Yeah. Anyway, he was like about to abandon the project and go like, I don't remember what it was. He had some like business opportunity he was going to do elsewhere. And then he suddenly got a grant. And then that's it. He has the money to work on his beautiful book. And then the book comes out and it continues to be extremely influential. And you get a lot of these academics that are still using it as though it's a legitimate resource. And if you tell them, no, it's not, then you get accused of censorship, of woke censoriousness, of being ideologically captured, just like the whole Marxist university, right? It's like this, they have this whole song and dance they'll do where it's attack, 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 but they can't actually defend the methods of the thing because it's indefensible.
Just to be pedantic, Richard Lynn's database actually wasn't published in its full form until 2002, but he had been working on race differences in IQ. He wrote a paper in Chemical Quarterly in, I think, 1991 that then would have influenced the bell curve.
Right.
His first paper was actually in 1978 on race differences in intelligence. The first sentence of that paper refers to subspecies differences in intelligence.
That is really sickening. Thank you for correcting me. I guess I just wanted to talk about the bell curve.
You're absolutely correct that Lynn heavily influenced the bell curve.
Right, his work, but not the database itself. Yeah.
I think a lot of this highlights the human compulsion to rationalize the thing as not bad. And so the scientific veneer helps to give my belief this sheen of respectability. This scientists believe this, right? This is not me being a Klan member. This is science. What am I going to do about science? I can't refute science, and neither can you, right? And that's what they're always going at.
This is that thing also that was in the Bo Weingard paragraph that I read you, which is this idea, and we talked about it in the trans rights episode as well, that there are people out there saying, like, listen, I want egalitarianism. I want full rights for all kinds of people. But unfortunately, like, the numbers, man, it's just that, like, the science says that I can't do it. So I want to show you William Shockley talking to William F. Buckley Jr. in 1974 on the show The Firing Line, which was William F. Buckley Jr.'s interview/debate program. And yeah, we're going to see the same thing that Bo Weingard said 10 days ago, but we're going to see it coming out of 1974, Shockley. And this is something important to say too. William Shockley, Nobel Prize winning electrical engineer, professor at Stanford at the time. And he essentially did this whole career of electrical engineering where it was amazing. Everybody was amazed by his brilliance. And then he went into this sort of fixation on race science and eugenics, where he has no background on these things, but he's just obsessed with it, right? He just loves it so much. So he goes on TV and he writes all these things and talks about why race science is right and real and good. Okay, William F. Buckley Jr. There we go. Bing, bang, boom.
I try to say precisely the same way, and that is my research leads me inescapably to the opinion. The major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficit is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, thus not remediable to major degrees by practical improvements in environment. I regard this as a tragedy and one that we should try to understand and to ameliorate.
Are you saying to me that substandard education, substandard environments, lack of mental stimulation in one's early childhood has absolutely nothing to do with performance in IQ tests?
Not at all. And the ratio here is that about 20% of whatever it is that pushes IQ around for typical Caucasian populations, and not as good studies yet for blacks. There's no offhand reason that I know, unless they are genetically very different from whites, why this ratio should be very different. But this 20%, which is of what pushes IQ around that one can attribute to environment, can, and in fact would be predicted to produce this remarkable case that frequently cited.
So yeah, it's a tragedy, right? It is so sad for me and you to have to admit to the world that race science is real and true and Black people are genetically inferior. I find this a lot in sort of reactionary discourses and in reactionary ideology, right? The way that they're trying to sell the idea is to be like, you and me, we're all really like big-hearted progressive liberals. Like we're not racist. We're not sexist, right? We are not ableists. We're not bigots in any way. We're simply following the science. And that's what you end up getting when you talk like that, is to be like, it's unavoidable, man. I'm so sorry. What else did I want to talk about? Oh yeah, being attacked, right? You get attacked. Oh God, let's talk to, do you know Richard Heyer? Who that is?
Yes.
Yeah, not do you know him personally, goodness. Okay, so who is Richard Heyer? a psychologist. I've lost my.
He's the ex-editor of Intelligence.
Got it. Okay. Oh, so he knows a lot about, pretending not to be into. Okay, American psychologist, researched a neural basis for human intelligence, psychometrics, general intelligence. Got it. Okay. Yeah, I've seen him on social media. He's got a lot to say about how race IQ is real. And so I just wanted to give this clip off of the Lex Friedman podcast, everyone's favorite podcast. Stop me if you've seen this one. I know we all have it playing in the background while we try to study. Okay, ready?
What do we know about, from that book and the research beyond, about race differences and intelligence?
It's still the most incendiary topic in psychology. Nothing has changed that. Anybody who even discusses it is easily called a racist just for discussing it. It's become fashionable to find racism in any discussion like this. It's unfortunate. The short answer to your question is there's been very little actual research on this topic since
since the bell curve.
Since the bell curve, even before. This really became incendiary in 1969 with an article published by an educational psychologist named Arthur Jensen. Let's just take a minute and go back to that to see the bell curve in a little bit more historical perspective. Arthur Jensen was a educational psychologist at UC Berkeley. I knew him as well. And in 1969 or 68, the Harvard Educational Review asked him to do a review article on the early childhood education programs that were designed to raise the IQs of minority students. This was before the federally funded Head Start program. Head Start had not really gotten underway at the time Jensen undertook his review stage, and they were specially designed to be cognitively stimulating, to provide lunches, do all the things that people thought would minimize this average gap of intelligence tests. There was a strong belief among virtually all psychologists that the cause of the gap was unequal opportunity due to racism, due to all. Jensen looked at these programs. He was an empirical guy. He understood psychometrics. And he wrote it was over 100-page article detailing these programs and the flaws in their research design. Some of the programs reported IQ gains of, on average, 5 points, but a few reported 10, 20, and even 30-point gains. One was called the Miracle in Milwaukee. That investigator went to jail ultimately for fabricating data. But the point is that Jensen wrote an article that said, look, the opening sentence of his article is classic. The opening sentence is, I may not quote it exactly right, but it's, we have tried compensatory education and it has failed. And he showed that these gains were essentially nothing. You couldn't really document empirically any gains at all from these really earnest efforts to increase IQ.
All right, that's enough of him. So he hit a couple of the points that we've covered so far, right? First of all, if you try to talk about this, you'll be called a racist. And then secondly, oh gosh, I mean, we've tried, right? We did all these environmental things and none of it worked. You only got a couple of points of IQ off of these kids. And then, you know, they're essentially the same as they were before because I guess what's left, right? It's got to be the IQ. It's got to be the genetics, right? He also hit another point, which I think we talked about in the, when we talked about that book about scientific controversies, right? The people who were trying to sell tobacco as a harmless, fun thing that you should give your kids, the people who are trying to say climate change isn't real, right? They all do this thing where they just say like, well, nobody's allowed to even look at it. So how can we even know, right? And one of our big lessons that we have taken is if somebody's telling you nobody's saying this or nobody's talking about this or nobody's investigating this question, you got to check, because they might just be saying that so that you don't check.
I can give another example of the quality of race science, if you like, from the 21st century. Race scientists do say that they're doing really good science and they're just being censored. But in 2008, the journal Intelligence, Richard High was its editor, but not at this point, it was the previous editor. They published a paper which essentially tried to prove that populations that lived further away from Africa were more intelligent. They used Richard Lynn's IQ database, but that wasn't in fact the worst problem with this particular paper. This particular paper, the way it measured distance from Africa, assumed the Earth is flat. That's a bit of an error, right? So this error was brought to the attention of the editor by, I think, at least two different people. The editor chose to do nothing. One of the sets of people who raised the concern with the editor, they subsequently wrote about their experiences. They said their commentary was sent out to review by the editor, but the reviewer said, oh, it's not such a big error. It's just a minor detail, the fact that this paper assumes the Earth is flat. So the editor chose to do nothing. That paper still sits in the literature, in the journal Intelligence, without even an expression of concern added to it, which is often added to papers which are considered somewhat dubious. So it still sits in the literature as if it were actual science. And it's a paper which assumes the Earth is flat.
That is simply out of control. I can't believe that.
It surprises me that they left it in the literature, if only because it's such a perfect example of how race science isn't science. These people are clearly not trying to understand the world. That's just not what they're doing here.
Right. Yeah, they're just saying what they think and then hoping nobody calls them on it. And then if somebody does, then they can say, oh, you're censoring me. I can't believe it. Oops.
When in fact, what they're talking about when they're talking about censorship is peer review, which is how science works.
Yeah,
they're being critiqued because their methods are terrible. That's simply peer review. It's not censorship. It's not cancellation. It's peer review. It's literally how science is supposed to work.
Right. Also a misrepresentation, I think, of how the retraction or like post-publication review process works, right? Anytime one of these things has an expression of concern stuck in front of it or is retracted, this is a really like normal process, right? That happens after something has been published, where other people in the field read it and say, I have noticed a problem that is enough of a problem that, like, there needs to be some note about it at least. And they'll contact the journal, and there's a process of review that happens there by which they decide whether to write something in the front, retract, or ask for the authors, right, to make an adjustment. And anytime that happens, I notice this happens in the race science crew. This also happens in the anti-trans crew. Anytime that happens, they will bring it to somewhere like social media or to the news and say, I can't believe the woke mob has come for me and my excellent science. And they will paint the people who challenged their publication as irrational, emotional. Often they'll use metaphors of religious zeal, right? They'll be like, oh, we've challenged their sacred cow or whatever, or like they're on a crusade.
They go to those folks for a reason, to get that validation, because they know that if they run to you or Rebecca, they're going to get told that the science is junk, and to get that out of here. And you folks could explain it in such a way that people might understand it. So instead of doing that, you just run right to the folks and be like, look, it's the aristocracy once again, the aristocracy of the mind. They won't let us think. They won't let us have these feelings that we've always felt. They don't care about it all working. They care about feeling nice.
It isn't woke to believe the Earth is not flat. It isn't woke to believe scientists should state their methods. It isn't woke to believe you can't estimate a national IQ from 19 people.
Well, I regret to inform you that apparently it is. And that's why woke science has captured academia, and that's why these publications keep getting made, keep getting through review. There's another story that I remember happening a few years ago, which was an article that was called something like "In Defense of Colonialism," that it was rejected. I believe it was even like desk rejected. And then the editor-in-chief came in and overrode it and sent it to reviewers, who then also rejected it. And then the editor-in-chief said, no, actually, we're going to put it out. And then people objected because that's ridiculous, right? And that somehow became a story of the woke people canceled me, by the author of that particular piece, right? So it really doesn't matter how careful you are, how rigorously you apply the procedures of academic peer review, or post-publication review. Any attempt to counter these kinds of arguments gets painted as censorship. And it is a kind of changing the subject, right? It's a way to not have to defend the actual merits of the argument, but instead talk about how I'm not allowed to even present my argument. Never mind my 5 book deals and my 6 published articles and my repeated appearances on the Lex Friedman podcast or whatever, which is a really widely circulated podcast. It's not like, I joked about like, stop me if you've seen this one, but a lot of people have seen it. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, the weaponization of free speech arguments is really problematic too. They argue that they have to have their views heard because of free speech, but they're confusing free speech and academic freedom. Mm-hmm. They're basically trying to claim academic freedom as the freedom to say literally anything such as the earth is flat, but that's free speech, it's not academic freedom. You shouldn't be publishing papers in academic outlets that say the earth is flat, because we know this isn't. If you want to stand on a street corner and say the earth is flat, you should be free to do so. That's free speech. Right. I think this weaponization of free speech is really problematic. And free speech absolutism, the argument that you should be allowed to say literally anything regardless of the harm it causes. Well, there's the well-known saying, freedom for wolves means death to lambs. No society has ever been completely open and it's free speech, and in allowing free speech, there are always some limits on free speech. So free speech absolutism is certainly becoming a real problem here in the UK.
I'm channeling Kierkegaard when he said they demand the freedom of speech in lieu of the freedom of mind, which they do not exercise. We're capable of thinking, and if we would like to think, certainly there are wonderful folks who are producing incredible information and data and really allowing for us to see who and what we are and what the world is. But if all we wish for is to validate our own preconceptions, well, we're not getting any further than where we already are. I feel like Francis Bacon. Why am I quoting everyone today?
Yeah, you're doing a lot of quotes, dude. That's not actually out of the norm for you, though. But it does remind me of our first episode, or our first podcast guest, Bradford Vivian, who wrote the book Campus Misinformation, who talked about this idea that it is not actually a violation of anybody's rights to have an idea of a person as credible or not credible before you decide whether to invite them to speak on your campus or on your podcast or whatever, right? It's a similar idea that, the freedom to speak is not the same thing as the freedom to access a platform that's associated with academic rigor or that has the money behind it to be distributed to lots and lots of people, right? Like, those are not actually equivalent things. And if you're a university and your job is to bring people on to your campus, for example, that have an educational or social benefit to your students, you do actually have the right to exercise discernment about that based on the past actions and statements of the person who's asking for access to your student population, right? That is not a violation of free speech to say, somebody like Charles Murray is not an acceptable speaker on our campus because he does not provide academic or social benefit to our students. In fact, he is likely to bring misinformation, debunked data, the kinds of things that, if they are presented in a way that is unchallenged, will leave our students walking away with a false set of beliefs about the earth and about the people that live on it.
Been talking to historians lately, and they really emphasize the role of institutions in enforcing academic freedom, if you like. It really is institutions who should make sure that the people who are being invited to speak on campus, the people who are being published in academic journals, the people who are invited to speak at academic conferences are doing good methodologically rigorous research. You might get rogue individual researchers out there who are doing poor quality work. Well, just let them be. But institutions need to be the gatekeepers who are not inviting them to speak, who are not publishing them in journals. And I think part of the reason for the spread of scientific racism in some parts of academia is that there are some institutions that have just completely failed at that gatekeeping task. I'm thinking again about the intelligence community. The society allows pretty much anyone to speak at their conferences, and they publish pretty much anything, as far as I can tell, in their journals. And they sometimes openly justify that. They say it's the first editor before Richard Heyer would publish editorials where he would say it's important to have controversial research out there so that sunlight can disinfect it. But if reviewers have already said this work is methodologically bad, you don't need to publish it in your journal. You've already been through a peer review process. You should actively not be publishing that kind of material in your journal. So I think it's a real failure of institutions that is partly responsible for the problem of scientific racism in academia in the 21st century.
I think this sunlight is the best disinfectant thing is such a weird, weak excuse, right? So what'll happen inevitably is you're going to put out whatever the article was that was submitted to you. It's going to have a lot of mistakes in it. It's going to have a lot of wild, crazy claims that don't make any sense and generally suck, right? And a bunch of people are going to read that associated with a name that sounds good and fancy, like, the Society for Intelligence Research or whatever. And they're going to just see that because whatever sunlight hits it later, that's not attached to the original piece, right? They're going to see, if they see it at all, it's going to be later and it's going to be from somewhere else. And it's just not going to have the effect that you imagine, right? This is the sort of lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can lace up its boots. It's not an effective way to give people multiple perspectives as we purport to want to do, because the opposing perspective is way disadvantaged by virtue of time between the two points of view coming out and by virtue of the resources, right? So what's happening with these societies and these journals that have basically no editorial standards? Why are they here? Why do they exist? Where are they coming from?
I cannot answer that question. It baffles me. It completely baffles me.
Yeah. So, I'm pretty, not so much lately, but I do check in. I'm pretty fixated on this guy, Steven Pinker, mostly because he made my life and my friends' lives really hard a few years ago. But I look at him and the different organizations that he's a part of, and it's just an absurd number of, boards of things that he's on, an absurd number of editorial boards and advisory boards and panels and research groups and think tanks. And his CV has to be longer than a CVS receipt. I don't know how he keeps track of all of it. But then you look at them and they all are basically for the same two things, right? It's either it's an academic freedom organization, which we've covered what that's really a front for, or it's an intelligence group, which is a lot of these different groups that maybe if they existed 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 years ago, they would have had the word eugenics in them. But now they're no, we're just, we like brains. We're just about brains. Don't you like brains? Everybody likes brains, right? And it's this sort of whitewashing thing, but if they're all for the same thing, why are there 600 of them? I think part of it is donors, right? There's people who have a goal, a eugenic goal, and they have got some extra cash lying around, so they will kind of use that to help create the impression that there's lots of scholars that are hoping to uncover the truth about the genetic impact on intelligence or pro-social, whatever, civilizational impulses in humanity, right? They're saving civilization.
Yeah, and I think that the more foundations and institutions of proper breeding and all of these dumb things that they come up with. I think that it is also a function of trying to flood the zone with attention, with a feeling of this is legitimate, right? We have to legitimize ourselves, and people trust institutions that have fancy names that make it sound like we're doing high-minded and positive work. And so, of course, I'm a part of the all babies are good babies as long as they're smart group, right? Like this is all good above the board scientific work, and you'd be a fool to ignore it. You'd be woke to ignore it, Rebecca. Everything is woke. Everything that disagrees with me is woke, Rebecca. Did you know that?
Gosh.
But one reason for the really poor quality of the work from people like Richard Lynn might be because they're not actually trying to convince other scientists on the whole. They just need to get their work published in a friendly journal. Really, they're looking to the outside world. And outside of science, people don't necessarily have the skills to identify whether science is good or bad. It doesn't need to be good because they're not on the whole trying to convince scientists.
What to do, Rebecca? What do we do about a eugenics society? How do we? I mean, in the academic sense, how do we go about trying to rid our institutions of drivel like this?
I think that's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer. I mean, it's been a depressing journey realizing how firmly embedded this stuff is in academia and how difficult it is to remove. I've requested retractions of quite a few national IQ papers now and have achieved one retraction so far. Most journals are just not interested in engaging with concerns raised about their research. I think there are very significant problems here, and I should say a lot of that I don't think is because journals are trying to publish scientific racism. They just, academic incentive structures don't prioritize research integrity, so journals and editors don't particularly care if research they publish is good quality or not. So I'm actually quite pessimistic. I think it is a very serious problem, and I'm not entirely sure what the solution is. If you have any suggestions, please let me know.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, so part of why this podcast even exists is it's sort of directed at the audience of the liberal currents as a whole, right? Which is liberals and progressives, people kind of all on the general left half of the spectrum, warning ourselves essentially about the kinds of things that can fool us, right? So one of your kind of what can we do was learn to resist the claim that censorship is the same as being right. You know, that like I'm being silenced, therefore whatever I say is true. That is not logical, right? And it also rests on this claim of censorship that doesn't actually follow, right? We in the United States have been watching a systematic defunding and erasure of research that is considered woke. It is not the other way around, right? And I think that another thing that people can learn to do is to just learn to spot the hallmarks of a created controversy, right? A situation where there's a group of people who are saying the science is not settled. We need to do more research on why Black people are dumber than white, right? That has inside of it a couple of claims that are false, and that you can find out if they're false with a little bit of research. You don't have to read all of the papers, but you only really have to go on Google Scholar or whatever to find out that the research really is being done. That the bulk of the research falls on the other side of the claim, you know. So those are the things that that hopefully we can help do, right? And then also to not take people's claims about their goals at face value, right? So we have these people saying I don't do eugenics. It's not about eugenics. Actually, it's just about selecting for the traits from the DNA that are better. That's not eugenics. Well, that is eugenics, right? The other thing that they often claim is, look, we're not looking for enforced eugenics, right? It's not that I want the government to be rounding people up and sterilizing them. That has inside of it a couple of falsehoods too. Number one, we do live in a country where people get sterilized against their will, much less now, but even as recently as the 1970s, there were programs to do it to large groups of people. That's your parents, that's your cousins, depending on what generation you're from, that it could have happened to, right? But also the eugenics movement going back to the 1890s often sold itself on the basis of being voluntary, right? So they would, in the United States, we had the eugenics registration office, and you could kind of get your family genealogy together and go to that office, and they would tell you if you were at risk of having like low quality children. And then you could decide for yourself if it was a smart idea to go ahead and produce those low quality children. Well, in what way is that terribly different from going to Orchid, right, and getting genetic testing on your embryos and them telling you the likelihood of your children being high quality or low quality? It's not really. It's just the sort of neoliberal, sort of capitalist version of eugenics. It is still eugenics. So yeah, that's one of the things we can do is we can try to learn to spot claims that have lots of little claims embedded in them before we accept them wholesale. We can learn to spot false claims about censorship. We can learn to spot false claims that nobody's saying this, right? Those are the ones that people often use to sneak bad ideas into the mainstream. So it's not hopeless. That's what I'm saying. We just have to teach everyone in the world really good critical thinking skills and media literacy. It's not hard.
To end on a slightly more optimistic note, the book Merchants of Doubt, which I'm sure you've mentioned on this podcast before, is a fantastic book which starts talking about the tobacco strategy. Right. Exactly what you said earlier, these tobacco companies trying to create doubt about the settled science that smoking causes lung cancer. That book, on the one hand, is very depressing because it talks about all of these cases where people for political or commercial gain try and manipulate science, also in terms of climate change denial and so on. But ultimately, I think the book is optimistic because it does illustrate that science does progress. Science is progressing all of the time. People are constantly trying to hold it back for political or commercial gain, but science does ultimately win out. Certainly in the case of climate change, for example, it's absolutely settled science now that climate change is anthropogenic. So maybe to end on a more optimistic note, I think science does ultimately progress, but it's hard work. And we do have to do all of those things that you just suggested to prevent the misuse of science for political gain.
I think so. And I think there's something optimistic about the fact that they're using the same tactics still, which means that like once we've learned what those tactics are, it's easy to see through them, right? They're not the most creative thinkers in the world. And so they're not coming up with like amazing new strategies to try to sell pseudoscience to us, it turns out. So yeah, Merchants of Doubt is great. And also those same lawyers that helped with the tobacco industry's attempt to create the idea that it's not really settled that tobacco hurts people, those same lawyers also did help with the race science industry to do the exact same thing. So it truly is the same strategies by the same people. It's out of control. That's where Dark Money, it's on my shelf. That's why I keep pointing that way. That's silly. That's why Dark Money also is a helpful read for that kind of information, because it shows some of the same characters up to the same nonsense, just for different kind of groups of people. So yeah, that's optimistic. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And thank you for coming on Half the Answer and for helping us understand the ways in which academia has been kind of suckered by this ideology and some of the things that we can do to help resist it. I wish you the best of luck in getting more of those Lin database things retracted. I cannot believe that. If there's anybody who's in the field, the relevant fields listening, go ahead and make an attempt of your own. See what happens. Maybe you'll have more luck. I don't know. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you.
This has been Half the Answer, where understanding a question is half the answer. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.